And I have a question also for Chris. So yesterday we had witnesses who were encouraging us to take what they called a systems approach to climate change. So you described from the psychological effect, what's going on in people's head, what a systems approach means, right? So the attractive bit of what I thought was your really interesting evidence about what effect that's having on people's ability to choose was your last sentence, which was, you said we have ways of breaking through. What are the ways of breaking through?
Right, so that's a very big question you've asked, which is taking us also into question 2. I think from the perspective of the Climate Action Unit, we take a very systems-driven approach, and we look at the whole system, at how media messages get translated into understanding of the public, how science and policy communicate with one another, how businesses and policy communicate with one another. And looking at that systemic that systemic picture, we then identify the things that aren't working within that system. We're talking here today about the way that media and public understanding are related to one another, but we often do work in these other places as well. We often do work with scientists and policymakers, bringing them together with businesses and helping them to talk to government about regulation and so on. But within that systemic approach, within that sort of bird's eye view that you take on the whole landscape of all the organizations and players and sectors involved in these conversations, we then see that there are specific things going wrong in each of these places that can be understood from the things that we know about how the human brain works from psychology and neuroscience. And we've already heard several factors being described. We heard the social norms today, we heard cost and easiness of adopting certain solutions. Those are drivers of behavior. But what is often missing, the thing in our experience that is often missing, is the agency, the knowing how to do something. And that question of knowing how to change your behavior, of how to adopt a certain new practice, either in a professional space, which we're hearing examples here from Matt talking about the struggles that the advertising industry is having with that how are they implementing the 5 promises that they've made, all the way to people in the business communities, in the policy communities, in the science communities. They're all struggling with that, how can I do more, how can I change? And there are many different ways that you can work with these communities to help them start answering that question of how. And a lot of our work is very bespoke interventions with communities of experts, or with bringing different sectors together and getting them to talk to each other and collaborate more effectively. But when it comes to communication, mass communication to the public, the answer to the question of how do you break through that confusion and fragmentation is that you need to tell the stories of the how. You need to tell the stories of how to do this, the actions, the journey, the struggles that a person has to adopt a certain lifestyle or a certain type of behavior. That can be very small stories about very small types of behaviors, but it can also quite be much bigger ones. I'll give a couple of examples, because it's not just enough to talk about the solutions. If you only talk about the solution, you might give a false sense of optimism, and you might lose a lot of the people paying attention to it because they say, oh, it's been taken care of, I don't need to care about this anymore. But if you tell the story of the actions, of the series of actions that allows a person to overcome challenges and find their mettle and build their skill and build their agency, and you tell almost that hero's journey of that way of overcoming these challenges, then what you're doing is you're activating social learning in the people who are reading those stories. Most of the learning that we do, most of the ways that we learn how to deal with the world around us is from the people around us. We look at them, we see them solve a challenge, and then we can absorb that and apply that in our own way of dealing with that challenge. And I'll give a specific example now. A short while ago, we trained a small group of journalists in this, what we call action-based storytelling. So moving away from climate change, where you talk about it as an issue, as a threatening issue that we need to act on, but then you leave it sort of unspoken what the actions are. And you move towards this what we did is we helped those journalists to move towards that action-based storytelling, where they looked for examples of stories in the communities around them and tried to turn a story about, let's say, retrofitting from something about the issue of heat pumps, whether they're good or bad, that's an issue-based framing, into a story of a pensioner finding out how to navigate the green grants of the government, step by step discovering what she needed to do with that, insulate her home, put double glazing in, then get the heat pump in that was appropriate for her home. And so that story is now being told by these journalists that have gone through the training. So the training was in November. It took them a while to experiment this, to find out how they can shift the way that they're telling stories about climate in that way. And that story appeared a few weeks ago, I think, in the Cornish press and has since been picked up by ITV. Because it's not a story about climate change. It's not a story about doom and gloom. It's a story about a pensioner on a very small fixed income finding her way through that challenge of retrofitting her home. At the moment, most people turn away from retrofitting their homes because the barriers are too high, and they look at the available evidence and they go, or all the available resources, and they go, this is too difficult for me, I can't deal with this. It's going to be too costly, my house is going to be dusty for 3 months, and I don't even know which of all of these options that I have to choose here. And that's what that confusing communication landscape creates at the moment. Now, that story of the pensioner that was written in a Cornish press and then picked up by ITV, it has that really nice journey of this person solving these challenges and finding out with all of her own skills and agency the steps that she needed to take to come to the place where she now has a warm and comfortable home. So it's not in this story about turning down a thermostat. It's about getting a warm and comfortable home that doesn't cost her a lot of money to heat. And somewhere in the piece, she says, I'm a pensioner on a very small income. If I can do it, then so can you. And that's the kind of story we need to get to. By every story that we are listening to, we need to get the sense, if that person could do it, then so can I. And that's how you create sort of like that movement towards everyone figuring out what their role is in that big picture that needs to happen.